Welcome to another episode of Shattered Lives, the Irish Daily Star's crime podcast with Paul Healy and Michael O'Toole. It's very rare for one of the country's most experienced and highly regarded detectives to use the word psychopath, but that is the term Michael O'Sullivan utters in the pod tonight when he talks about a certain Cornelius Price. It's not Michael's first rodeo. He led the Organised Crime Bureau, got to the rank of Assistant Commissioner and spent decades facing down serious criminals. So when he calls someone a psychopath, I certainly perk up my ears. As you may know, Cornelius Price died from a long-term underlying illness in Wales over the weekend, but he was regarded as one of Ireland's most dangerous criminals, and Michael does not hold back when talking to us about Price on Shattered Lives tonight. Price is feared to have committed at least 6 murders and even tried to attack and intimidate Gardai. As well as speaking with Michael, Paul and I also examine Price's crimes, and Paul speaks to a mother of one of his victims.
So Mick, one of the great things about continuing to do this pod is that we can talk about live news, and crime never really stops, as you know, but there was a major development yesterday evening with the death of Cornelius Price, and I think I'll hand it over to you because you would have heard this name long before I did. The name Cornelius Price is something that you've been skirting around for many years in association with God knows how many crimes. So when was the first time you heard the name Cornelius Price?
You're quite right, Paul. The beauty of this pod is that we can react, and as you know, we have been doing it mostly about the trial of Jerry the Moncuch, but we're widening it out, and we do think that Cornelius Price is a worthy subject because he really was a very, very serious criminal. So, like many things, there are lots of criminals whose names I don't know. I mean, that's just the reality. There are people who just lie beneath the radar. But I first heard, and I'm sure others had before this, but I first heard of Cornelius Price in the context of the murder of a man called Benny Whitehouse, who was shot dead in Balbriggan in late 2014. So he was killed as part of a drugs feud. He had been involved in an ongoing feud. He'd attacked, in the previous year, he'd attacked Cornelius Price over the rivalry of the drugs feud. And Cornelius Price got his revenge almost a year later when he shot him dead as he was dropping his children to school in Balbriggan. And Mr. Whitehouse's partner was also shot in the leg in that incident. And it was I can remember the murder itself. It was a broad daylight murder at a school, and you can't get much more shocking than that. So while we were investigating this, the name Cornelius Price came about. Now, because of Ireland's defamation laws, good or bad, whatever people think about them, there's obviously no way that we could name Cornelius Price because he was a suspect for a murder. But look, his name has become, I think it's fair to say his name has become increasingly out there in the last couple of years. And we know that he has been, he was living over in Wales, I believe, largely because of the Drogheda feud. Now, we're not going to, this pod isn't really about the Drogheda feud. Nicola Donnelly, who's an expert on all things Drogheda-esque, is one of our top reporters in the Star, and I'm going to be talking to her later on in the week, hopefully, about the wider Drogheda feud, including the horrendous murder of young Ciaran Mulready Woods. We know that 2 men were sentenced for facilitating that murder last week, so I don't really propose to go into depth about the murder of Ciaran Mulready Woods or the feud in general. This is more about Cornelius Price. Now, I was doing some basic totting up there. I think Gardai do believe that he was involved in several murders, starting with Benny Whitehouse in 2014. But by my calculations, I can think of 6 murders altogether that Gardai would believe he was involved in. Now, there might be more, but 6 is a significant number, and it just goes to show you how dangerous Cornelius Price is. He was a criminal. He was based in Gormanstown, which is between Balbriggan and Drogheda, just on the coast there, I suppose, quite near the M1. And it was a compound, and it was very hard for Gardai to get into that compound. There were walls around it. It was a compound, a bit of a fortress. It really was his bailiwick, and I think he treated it like that. But as I said, he did become involved in the Drogheda feud, and there were at least six killings that we can find that have been attributed to him. Now, we've mentioned the first one, which is that of Benny Whitehouse in Balbriggan. Then subsequent to that, there were two in 2014, but I'm going to skip those because I want you to talk about them, Paul, because they're very, very significant cases. But the Drogheda feud then, I suppose, consumes, so that's three, and then there are three other murders in the Drogheda feud that have been attributed to Cornelius Price and his gang. So the first one would be a man called Keith Brannigan, who was shot dead as he was working on a mobile home. It wasn't his home. He was a carpenter. I seen Drogheda. I remember he'd been up in the scene. It was I think it was a summer's day, and he was shot dead as he was working on decking, and that was August 2019. A few months later, in November 2019, and a few miles away, it was in Bettystown, which is near Laytown, just on the beach there. A drug dealer called Richie Carberry was shot dead at his home. So he would have been on the opposing side to Price in that feud. And then the final murder that I'm going to talk about is that of an infamous hitman himself. I remember writing about this man, Robbie Lawler, who was shot dead in North Belfast in 2020. You need to be slightly careful because people are before the courts in relation to that in Northern Ireland. But what I can say is that Robbie Lawler himself was an infamous killer, had been blamed, I think, for around 6, I remember, maybe more, maybe 7 murders himself. So he was a very, very dangerous person, and he was shot dead in North Belfast in April 2020. Now, again, I have to be careful because people are before the courts. So that's 4 of the 6. But there were, in April 2015, a couple went missing. They were last seen at Price's compound in the Gormanstown area, and that was Ana Varslavane and Willie Maughan. Now, the interesting aspect to this is Gardai are treating their case as murder, even though neither body has been found. And it's quite rare. That has happened a couple of times. It's extremely rare for Gardai to do that, because it's usually a missing person case. But this case has been upgraded, and I know that you would have some insight into this case, Paul.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to believe that it's the 14th of April 2015, that it's been that long since the disappearance and murders of William and Anna. And it's a case that we have been writing about over and over and over the years, because there's been non-stop developments and intimidation tactics from Cornelius Price and his gang, which has resulted in us writing stories about that. But Willie Maughan was not an organised criminal. Was somebody who was, according to his family, trying to live on the straight and narrow, and was going back to Tala and getting away from things, people that he was caught up with and involved with. And unfortunately, he caught the ire of Cornelius Price because Cornelius Price believed that William Mohan had information about the murder of Benny Whitehouse, which you've mentioned, and he was afraid that Willie Maughan, who was trying to live on the straight and narrow, more or less, might give him up, and that he might pass information on that might result in Cornelius Price getting done for the Benny Whitehouse murder. So, it gives you an insight into the ruthless kind of character that Cornelius Price was, because he made the decision to have Willie murdered. And Willie was lured to this site in Gormanstown in County Meath, along with his pregnant partner, Ana Varslavane. And sadly, they were murdered. And we know that they were murdered because this is something that the Price gang have taunted the family about for many years, and boasted openly about the fact that their bodies would never be found. And there were various different accounts over the years as to how they were murdered. And so everyone in the world of journalism certainly knew that Mr. Price was connected to this murder. And then as he committed more crimes and eventually ended up in jail, we were able to say more than we were in the beginning. We were able to eventually say that William and Anna were murdered by the gang associated with Cornelius Price. But now that Cornelius Price is no longer with us, we can come out and outright say that this murder was orchestrated by Cornelius Price himself. And in fact, he's believed to have even carried out the murder and to have been present during it, along with at least 12 other men. The family believed that there were 12 other people involved in this killing, and that it happened in this compound, as we've mentioned, in Gormanstown, and that the bodies were then disposed of. So there is a narrative that the bodies were that they were cremated, but the family don't believe that they're cremated. They believe that they are buried somewhere, and that there are people still out there who know what happened to William and Ana, and they now hope that with the death of Cornelius Price, those people will finally come forward and tell them where they are.
And I remember there was at least one search in the greater Gormanstown area. I think it was it in a quarry or something, or a landfill? I remember that.
Not far from that compound.
It's not too far. Not far. And I think Gardai did have high hopes that the bodies would have been recovered. And I know, just in relation to the cremation, I think Willie's mother got to the scene very quickly because Ana had rung Willie's mother, and people could hear, and they could hear her screaming, so they got there very, very quickly. And I think when Mrs. Mohan got there was a fire there, and I think that led some people to believe that they were cremating the bodies. But I think Gardai don't think that. I think Gardai themselves would believe that they are buried in the area. So, as has been said, with this man's death, I think he did sort of rule by fear. So maybe now somebody will do the right thing and come forward, because the shadow of Cornelius Price is gone from them.
Yeah, and we'll play it in a moment, but I had a very powerful chat today with Mr. Mohan's mother and father. You'll hear a clip with her consent. This is William's mother, Nell Maughan, and she is speaking to us about the death of Cornelius Price, what it means for her and her family, but also about the threat that they were under as a family. Like, even when, after, as we've mentioned, after these murders were committed, the family lived in well, they say they didn't live in fear, but they were fear tactics were placed upon them by Cornelius Price and his gang. And you'll hear Nell Maughan actually tell us that Cornelius Price brought men to her door and more or less told her to stop speaking out, or her life would be in danger.
Just before you play that clip, one of the horrendous issues for me in covering this case was a couple of years ago. Willie had a brother, Michael. Now, he died, I think it was from an illness. He died quite suddenly, and it was a good few years ago, and he is buried in, I think it's Tala, one of the graveyards in Tala. But a few years ago, I got a wee tip that the grave had effectively been dug up. So, I remember at the time, my belief was that there's the Price gang that were involved in that. So that's really unspeakable. They murdered Willie, they murdered Ana, they taunted the family, as you said, they called to the family's door, and then they effectively desecrated a man's grave. So it shows you, what's the word? I'm struggling to find a word. It really is unspeakable what was done to that family.
Yeah, but as you'll hear yourself from Mrs. Mohan, who's agreed to have her voice be heard on this pod, she's an incredibly strong woman, and they're a strong-willed family. And in spite of all of that, they never stopped speaking out. They continued to appeal for answers, to get justice. And they now hope, with the death of Cornelius Price, that there are people out there with a conscience who maybe might have feared Price and might now feel that there's no impediment, nothing stopping them from coming forward and telling what happened to William and Ana. In spite of all of those threats, they continue to speak out. So it's a real testament to them as a family.
Okay, so we might hear this clip now. This is you speaking to Willie's mother.
Nell, why do you think your son was murdered? What was that reason ever given to you? Not that anyone deserves to be murdered, but what was their disgusting reasoning for having your son killed?
Well, the reason my son was murdered was he had information of Billy Whitehouse's murder. And my son was moving back to Tala, and my son had information, and they were afraid that he was going to release that information.
Yes.
And I strongly believe that my son and Anna went straight to heaven, because my son didn't take a life. And God was looking down, and I do believe that the people that's done this to my son, there's a lot of them suffering now. And Price is gone. He won't put another family through the hurt and pain that my family's gone through. And the tears that I've been crying, my family's crying, let him, his family, see what death is like now. Let his mother go through the pain, and his family go through the pain that my family's been going through.
Yeah.
Because It's not a thing that you like to come to anyone's door. And no father or mother deserves to bury their child. And for to bury a child, but not get it's go and bury them. You can go and say, right, they're buried, give them burial. They'll be able to give him a burial. But I can't give my son a burial because I haven't got his body back to bury him.
Yeah. And I mean, there's been all sorts of rumours over the years as to where and what they did with your son's remains. But do you believe he's still out there? They're out there somewhere, and someone knows what happened in regards to their remains.
Look, the best way to put a rumour out that Willie Maughan was burnt. We don't believe that.
Yeah.
I don't believe it, and if I believed that, I wouldn't be standing today. And the bodies is obviously someone has information where the bodies are, but I'm just asking them, please, as a Christian, if you have any kind of belief in God, come forward and let's have closure for Willie Maughan. We truly deserve closure. What we're going through, we deserve it.
Absolutely. May I ask you before I let you go, the impact of all of this over the years on your family, what has it been like? I mean, have you been living in fear of Cornelius Price? I mean, he obviously the grave was targeted and that. Were you as a family ever in fear of him and what he might be capable of doing to ye?
No, I wasn't in fear of him, and neither was my family. We stood our ground from day one because my son was on his own. And it's very easy for one person and him and Anna, for one man and for Anna to be targeted with nobody around him by a gang. If you're surrounded by a crowd, you haven't got a foot to stand on.
Yeah.
So I wasn't in fear of him, and neither was my family. And I'm not in fear of him. And I've said that from day one.
Were you ever told by the guards, though, that there might be any kind of a credible threat or to yourselves from that gang?
Well, they did. They gave threats in early stages, but, and the pipe on my daughter's place, and they dug up my son's grave. But that didn't stop me from continuing fighting out for justice for my son.
Yeah.
And I continue doing it. He's my child.
Yes.
And I have every right to speak up for my child. I'm his mother. I brought him into the world, and I have every right to do it. And if I didn't speak up for my child, what kind of mother would I be?
Yeah.
And what kind of father would he have?
Yeah.
We have to do it. We have to continue fighting for justice for Willie Maughan to get them back.
And that fight doesn't end with the death of this man. There's still people out there that are responsible.
Yeah, exactly. So we would ask anyone that has information to come forward and give us closure.
Do you have any, I suppose now that he's dead and buried, thoughts on Cornelius Price and where he is now, and is he in hell, as your husband told me last night? Is that your belief?
Well, look, my belief is what you do wrong in life, it's like a clock. And when the clock comes to a certain time, and when your time is up, you have to face God.
Yeah.
I firmly believe he will never see the gates of heaven. He's gone down below to the fire. That's where he's gone. To take anyone's life and not give their bodies back, and get up there and try and make a laugh at people and social media, and coming in and mock pages.
Yeah. And
do you know what I mean? That's intimidating, bullying. But we didn't sit back and take that.
Am I right in saying that there were phone calls that he had with you as a family, where he did taunt you over the years?
Yeah, he gave threats on phone calls, yeah.
He did?
Yeah.
And you could tell, I mean, I suppose he's a pretty... you could tell it was him that was threatening you, as a family.
We know it was him. We know it was him because he sent people to my house to give the threat to me, not my husband out, to me, telling me if I didn't shut my mouth, I was going to be took out.
When was that?
Oh, that was the early stages when that happened to William. Yeah.
My God. But you stood your ground, as you said.
I stood my ground, and I continue to stand my ground where the strength is in my body as a mother. So
you never feared him, despite his attempts to try and make you fear him.
But why should I fear him?
Yeah.
Why should I fear him? Because when they killed my son in that property, right? My son was just there on his own, him and Anna. But I mean, if I went out to him with a crowd and stood up, wonder how would he feel?
Yeah.
But we didn't do that, Polly. We're doing things the right way, and that's the way we're going to continue doing it.
Yes. So yeah, thank you to the Mohan family for speaking to us. We should address just obviously Cornelius Price. He has died at the age of 41. We know he had a condition. He had a brain injury, and he was in hospital since October of 2021 and was in a coma. But as you might tell people, Mick, during all of this, he was in Wales and he was actually on trial for a kidnap plot, and unfortunately he evaded justice in relation to that.
Yeah, so essentially he got out of Wheatfield prison. He was serving a sentence for endangerment, and that was in essence in relation to an incident in the grounds of Balbriggan Garda station when he drove a car at a Garda, and that was all part of his intimidation. He was trying to intimidate Gardai. Balbriggan would have covered that area at one stage, so he was basically putting it up to the guards. And we know from speaking to sources that say things like, we know that he would have put nails. There's a bit of a turning circle where Gardai would have turned at his compound after sort of patrolling it, seeing if they could spot anything, and he put nails there. And I think there were several Garda cars their tires were really badly damaged while he was doing this. So he really was putting it up to him. On another occasion, he rang a guard, threatened his life. On another occasion, he got some of his acolytes to follow guards who were involved. So he really was, as I say, putting it up to them. But he got out, I think it was around 2019, May 2019, after serving a sentence here for endangerment. Things were getting really hot with the feud then, and he was under pressure as well. So he decamped to Wales, but maybe he thought he was leaving his criminality in Ireland. He was wrong, because he got involved in an alleged kidnap plot over there where a man was, I think 2 men were kidnapped and tortured. They were washed with Dettol. They were badly assaulted, and they had to, effectively ring their families and see if they would give them £300,000. Now, one man was convicted of that. Price was charged with that, but as you say, the illness got in the way, so he did escape justice. But it just goes to show you all those elements. He really was a dangerous criminal. Now, he has been extremely unwell for more than a year, so we would hear every so often that he was close to death, and there were several false alarms, but the news was confirmed on Sunday evening. Now, when I mentioned him putting it up to the guards, we're going to play another clip in a moment. Before the Kin and Hutch feud blew up in 2016, late 2015, 2016, there was a significant operation by what was then called the Organised Crime Unit and morphed into the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau against Price, because he was so dangerous. He was regarded as an extremely dangerous criminal. Now, I'm not saying that the Hutch feud, Kinnan feud took everything over, but there had to be significant National Garda resources put to dampening that feud and trying to end that feud. And we know that to be very successful. There've been more than 70 Kinnan gang members locked up. They've prevented more than 70 murders, and they've hit them really, really hard. Seized weapons, drugs, millions of euros. So it's been really successful. But before that, a lot of those resources would have been put, and those national resources would have been put on Price. That's how dangerous he was. It wasn't just local Garda. Operation Stratus was set up over the Drogheda feud, but before that there had been a national operation against Cornelius Price. And one of the people who was centrally involved in that is a man called Michael O'Sullivan. Now, he retired a few years ago as Assistant Garda Commissioner. In his previous job, before he got promoted to Commissioner, he was the Detective Chief Superintendent in charge of the OCU, what became the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau. So Michael, he also led, I think, a unit, after his retirement, he also led a unit called MAOC, which is the European Union's anti-drugs task force. It's the unit that catches all the drugs being brought from America to Europe. So we're going to talk to Michael about his career as a police officer in Ireland in the 80s and 90s. It's really fascinating stuff. We're going to talk to him later in the week. He arrested Christy Kinnan, for example. He was an undercover Garda. Listeners may have heard of the famous Mockies, who were the first real undercover Garda in the country buying drugs in the 80s. Noreen O'Sullivan, who was contemporary of Michael, would have been a Mockie herself. So he really is a legendary police officer and very, very well known. But he has taken a few minutes today to give us his reaction to the death of Cornelius Price and the background into the investigation that he led. So we're going to play this clip now, and it is really, really interesting. Former Assistant Commissioner Michael O'Sullivan, thanks for joining us today. Now, you are going to be one of the stars, I suppose, of an up-and-coming Sky TV show called Dublin Narcos. Now, I'm going to be wrecking your head about that later on this week because you've kindly agreed to talk to me at length and I will be interrogating you. But we wanted to take a few minutes today to talk about a man who I believe you crossed his path with, who died in Wales over the weekend. That would be Cornelius Price. Now, just to explain to our listeners, you did retire as an Assistant Garda Commissioner, but before that, you would have been the Detective Chief Superintendent in charge of the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau. I think, was it still known as the OCU when you were in charge as well, or was that in your time?
Yeah, the OCU, the Organised Crime Unit, was there. We amalgamated what was the GNDU, the Garda National Drug Unit. We amalgamated the Drug Squad and the Serious Crime Squad because of the way crime and drugs were no longer separated. So we amalgamated the two units and I was the chief superintendent in charge of it.
So the main man.
Yeah, it was a national remit really for drugs and organised crime, yeah.
And what in our previous conversations, I was really interested to hear that effectively Cornelius Price and his outfit was a significant target for what we now call Dugby.
Yeah, I suppose, yes, he was. You know, for a guy who came out of nowhere really, and his background, he punched well above his weight. I suppose the best way to describe him was he was an absolute evil psychopath, without doubt one of the most evil people I've come across. Just shows no mercy to anybody and seems to, he's not like your standard criminal who starts to make money, keeps his head down. He just thrived on conflict and violence, intimidation, torture, burning houses, dare I say, killing people. He was certainly involved in several murders, and generally intimidating everybody, and made serious efforts to intimidate local guards in Balbriggan, for which he served a sentence. But he was a guy who just, no matter what money or how he made it or where he made it, he just had to cause confrontation. He hadn't the intelligence to sit down and be quiet. He just had to be vicious and violent all the time. He's a one-man serious crime wave. He just, and he couldn't mind his own business.
And why, as you said, Michael, most criminals, they do keep their head down. Yeah. Why do you think he had this mindset?
There was just a vicious streak in him. Maybe he hadn't got the intelligence. He had the intelligence to make money and to sell drugs and all of those things. I think you couldn't tell him anything, and he just hadn't got the intelligence that you had to leave that street violence behind you. You're going to start making money on selling drugs. You can't be running around trying to burn guys' houses and try to intimidate people, all this mad stuff. But he had that vicious psycho streak. He would as quickly been involved in a stabbing as quickly made money, which he did. And
tell me, Michael, would it be fair to say that he perhaps, I don't know if confronted is the right word, but would it be fair to say he certainly put it up the local Gardai?
Oh, he would just, he would ring the local Garda station and threaten people. He at one stage drove into the local Garda station and narrowly missed knocking down a guard, in which he was prosecuted for. He just had to confront and be combative to everybody. He intimidated the public. He intimidated rival groups. He intimidated some of the people who worked with him, going to work in inverted commas, fellow criminals. And he basically made everyone fearful of him because they knew he was a complete nutcase. He would as quick as hold a conversation with you and would stab you at the same time. One of these, just complete evil head case.
And you would have been, I'm not going to say in his company, but I believe there was a bail hearing that you were taking part in. He was trying to get bail. I think it was for that incident when he tried to mow down the Garda, and you would have given evidence to the court trying to keep him in custody.
Yeah, I had to give evidence to keep him in custody because he was facing several charges. And obviously, if he got out, he would intimidate witnesses, if not flee the jurisdiction. But he didn't abide by any sort of laws. You had to understand this guy. If I remember correctly, the Criminal Justice Bureau some years ago took a lot of money from him. And when I first met him in around the courts, and he didn't cut the figure that you thought that caused so much mayhem and destruction in the past. And he, with his ill-gotten gains, bought some land outside Balbriggan and basically built this huge wall around it, and this sort of somewhere between a campsite and a derelict house. And he created this criminal compound, I suppose, for want of a better term, and organized his operations out of there. And he made it very difficult for the guards to patrol it and to search it and to visit it. It was just this criminal, this criminal location. I remember on one occasion when it was searched, we found a car, a derelict, a disused car, which was used to practice car bombs on. There was no evidence of that. There was no doubt about that. So it was just, that was the sort of individual he was. He had this nerve center, and it was just sort of a ramshackle and piece of land with this huge wall and forbidding sort of entrance to get into it, and difficult to get in and difficult to get out of. But it was he ruled that with an iron fist, and then anything outside of that, he carried out his feuds and all his other activities.
So he was effectively trying to learn how to make car bombs.
He was practicing them. He was seeing how effective they were. Yeah.
My God, and that would have been used against rival criminals or people who he believed had crossed him.
I'd say he'd use that against anyone he didn't like, whether it be guards or criminals who crossed him or people he took a dislike to. You're dealing with a psycho.
And tell me, is it true? Because I heard that, did he get some of his henchmen, or did he do it himself, to follow Gardai?
There was cases of that. Yeah, he did. He endeavoured to intimidate. There was a number of guards who were investigating him. There was a team of guards operating out of Balbriggan, and they were making inroads into his criminal enterprise and into the feud he was running and into the shootings he was involved in. And he didn't like the fact that they were being successful with their investigation, so he did his best to try and have some of them followed home and to intimidate them and to strike fear. That's how people like him operate. They operate by striking fear into people that they're put off bothering him, is what I'm trying.
And because he was such a threat, is that why national news like your own had to take him on, really?
Yeah, that is, we would give support to the locals and to give them extra resources. And when we began to see what he was up to, we certainly were giving resources to the local units in an effort to assist them. But that's what the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau did. We targeted criminals, high-profile criminals who are causing a lot of grief around the country by lending the resources we had with the local resources, because it can be bad luck in an area which is used to just standard policing and standard criminals, and a guy like this shows up and starts thinking he's Al Capone,
Now, you've been very direct about him. Now, some listeners may know that you would have had interactions with really, really, really serious criminals like Christy Kinahan. We're going to talk about him in another pod, which I'm going to hassle you about. But in comparison, I would consider, I don't know if you'd agree with this, I would consider Christy Kinahan a very smart criminal, because he's obviously been very successful. Is there any comparison to people like that, to what, I think the guards call them tier 1 criminals? Was Price anywhere near that? For intelligence even, or cunning?
No, he hadn't got the intelligence to be a tier 1 criminal. He could make money from selling drugs and kidnapping and intimidating people. But he was always that violent street criminal. He could make money one day, and instead of keeping his head down and putting it aside, he could see some guy he didn't like. He could cross the street and slash him. This crazy psycho stuff, which doesn't match in with a guy who's making money. It's you have to leave that behind. You can't be the local head case and the Godfather at the same time.
And look, I know this may have been a question for your colleagues in the Criminal Assets Bureau, but did he make much money, would you think? Or
I'd have to check, but what I'm saying is, my recollection was that there was a sizable amount taken from him. I couldn't be certain of what but it was a matter of public record. I remember reading about it even before long before I interacted with him. My understanding was that they took quite a lot of money.
And just one final question, Michael, and this has been really, really interesting. When you did interact with him, what did you make of him? What was the cut of his jib? Was he a small man? Was he, was he just a ruffian?
You could put him like that. You'd look at him in the dock and you'd say, is this guy what all this trouble's about? Really? And to look at him in the street, you think he's some sort of a handbag snatcher, or he'd break into a car, or he was that sort of, there was no finesse about him. It was just vicious, violent, psycho street criminal, and that's putting it in a nutshell, which was unusual for him to cause so much trouble that he caused over the years, and so much harm to people and distress and heartbreak to families.
Never trust a journalist when they say a final question. I've got one more. Look, guards will be circumspect. Former guards will be circumspect. That's no problem. Our sources tell us that they believe Price was involved in several murders. Would you believe that he was involved in that level of criminality?
I would believe he was. Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, it wouldn't bother him to murder people, and he was that callous sort of an individual. He like guys who would make some money and try to run some sort of a drug empire would get somebody to do the dirty work. This guy would go out and do it himself, and there'd be a 50-50 chance of getting caught. And there would be he wouldn't think of what's down the road. He wouldn't think of the publicity, the pressure from the police, the pressure from the media, the notoriety. I wouldn't enter into it. Which made him even more dangerous. He couldn't see sense, that guy. You couldn't talk to him.
So now this is really interesting. So you would believe, because most criminal godfathers or criminal boss cyclists wouldn't get their hands bloody. Would you think that, from your intelligence and from your evidence and from what you hear at the time, do you believe that he had direct involvement in serious crime like murders?
The guy was a psycho. He would murder, stab, shoot somebody, or drive over somebody. At the drop of a hat, it would just occur to his mind to do that, and he'd do it. And it's not so often you meet guys that are that evil. Really, he's exceptionally evil, and I can't stress that.
So so this would be maybe not once in a career, because you had a very long and very illustrious career, but it is extremely rare to meet a criminal like him.
Do you know it is? It is. Most criminals, one way or the other, you could hold some sort of a conversation. They may hate you and you may not particularly like them. But they would have the intelligence. They would have the intelligence not to drive into the yard of a police station and drive over a policeman. It isn't a good idea, But when you have a guy thinking like, well, with a balaclava on a dark night, what is he liable to do? So he would just take a mad notion, and he was just a psycho. And there's not too many of them around, really, believe it or not, in that business.
It's fascinating to get the insight of an officer who investigated Cornelius Price. So I think that's very powerful.
Yeah. So as I said, we'll be talking to Mick in a few days just about the rest of his career, and that'll be really, really interesting. Not many guards can talk about arresting Christy Kinnan and following all the way through, because Michael would have been involved in the Kinnan Hutch, in preventing the Kinnan Hutch feud and policing the Kinnan Hutch feud. So he saw the Kinnan organisation from the start until it got really, really powerful. So that'll be interesting. We would hopefully do that later on the week, but I'd say that'll be us for today. We just wanted to do a very quick and very live pod into the life and death and murders of Cornelius Price.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much.